That's the first step in self-efficacy, is somebody believing in you.
I have the privilege of being alive in 2025 and being able to help my fellow man and my planet. That is a privilege. That's not just bullshit.
Positive contributions are about giving that positive energy to everybody around you, because you know what? You get it back.
The culture itself brings so many gifts to humanity.
I would ask you to shine that light, for goodness.
This whole voyage of positive development, including this podcast, is one of the most gratifying adventures I've been on. Hello and welcome to the Positive Development Podcast. My name is Bart Colen and this is my co-host, Dante Ciolfi.
Hello.
Positive Development Podcast explores the shift from sustainable development's frequently cautious approach of do less harm to positive development's more forward-leaning and optimistic approach of do more good. Each week we engage with professionals from diverse fields, asking questions related to three key principles. 1, a shift in mindset. 2, the practical application of do more good approaches. And 3, the global replicability of such approaches. These questions aim to uncover innovative yet practical ways individuals and organizations can enhance their impact through positive development. Because our primary aim on this podcast is not only to learn about our guests, it is to learn from our guests. And finally, before introducing our guest today, I'd like to reiterate the fact that we do live in a time of a great deal of tension and divisiveness, but part of the reason why we created this Positive Development Podcast is because even if only during the course of this podcast itself, we want to create a safe space for you, our viewers, our guests like Ella, and for Dante and me, the hosts, create a safe space in which we are permitted to be optimistic, because it seems like we live in a world these days where we sometimes need to be reminded that we have permission to be optimistic. So with that, I'm going to introduce today's guest, Ella Henry, and I am not going to go into a long introduction, because very often what happens in contexts like these are that people basically read tired, hackneyed introductions, biographical information to people that you can find on Wikipedia. We find it's better if the guest speaks about him or herself in terms of an introduction. So all I will say about our guest today, to whom we are very grateful that she's here, is that she is a New Zealand Maori academic, and she has been involved with all sorts of movements related to the environment and also the preservation of her culture in New Zealand. So Ella, welcome again. And if you don't mind, if you would provide us with an introduction of yourself that you think best encapsulates your background, your history, your areas of focus, and where it is that you would like to go in the future.
Well, first I will start in my language by saying kia ora. So that is a Maori term which means I see you, I greet you, and I wish you wellness. So kia ora, not just to you, but to all of the listeners out there. As you said, my name is Ella Henry. That's a very the Europeanized version of our name, but it works for me, and it's in my passport, so I'll hang with that. And I am a professor of entrepreneurship in the business school at Auckland University of Technology. I have been involved in the academic world for much of the last 35 years, but I'm 70, so I had a full life before I came to university and academia. As you in our introduction, I did quite a lot of traveling around the world. As that character from Pulp Fiction said, I was a bum who walked the earth for quite some time. Love Samuel L. Jackson. Anyway, but one of the things about coming to university late is that I was part of a generation that learned my true history as a Maori, because I grew up in a country where I was told we had exemplary race relations, which when you live next door to white people who treat you shabbily, somehow that picture doesn't work, because you grow up thinking, oh, I'm an inferior person because I'm brown and I'm indigenous and, but I'm living in a country that's telling me that we have these wonderful race relations. And of course, that was the part of the mythologizing that justified colonization. But I'm jumping ahead. So I am a mother, I'm a grandmother, which I think are actually my two most important jobs. Certainly as an Indigenous person, is to be producing the next generations in some way or another, whether they are born out of us or not, is such an important part of our job as human beings. So I'm very glad that, as I plummet towards my dotage, my children still like me and speak to me. And my grandchildren think I'm fun, so that's cool. Those are my proper day jobs. But teaching entrepreneurship is very much has come out of my research and realizing that I come from a culture, and it's just not just Maori, but all of the peoples of the South Pacific. We have one language and one DNA foundation, and for 3,000 years we looked at the horizon and we didn't see dragons; we saw opportunity. And we hopped into our double-hulled canoes and we sailed across the ocean. And we did that for thousands of years. So every island in the South Pacific that has an Indigenous population, those are my kin. And at some point or another, and I know this from my DNA, we got as far as Peru. And in my case, we brought back a dusky maiden because I have 1% Native American from the South in me. So we brought the sweet potato, the kumara, into the Pacific at least 1,000 years ago. It grows everywhere. So this notion of us being somehow lost and washing up on the shores is clearly not backed up by archaeology. We were voyagers. We took risks. We sailed over the horizon without knowing exactly where we were going. And those, for me, are aspects of entrepreneurship which really underpinned my research in the area, and also is how I've ended up being a professor of entrepreneurship. So, sorry, that was a bit of a long-winded introduction and I went all over the place, but that's just a little bit about me and who I am.
That's brilliant. No, it wasn't, believe me, it wasn't long-winded at all. There's a lot of great stuff in there. And that's the reason why, and I apologize that I didn't prep you for that, the fact that you would essentially be introducing yourself. But that's the reason why we like to do it that way, because just going through and reading all of this stuff that's printed online, you never know how a person sees him or herself. So it's always much better to hear how someone like you see yourself. So that's great. I appreciate that. So I'd like to start, as we've discussed and as our viewers know, we do at least try to ask our questions in series of 3. So first addressing a mindset shift, because that's essential to making any kind of change. Then secondly, going into the practical application of that change. And then thirdly, looking at the global replicability. So starting out, I'd like to ask you a question by reading first something that I came across that you had said that I thought was absolutely beautiful. And then I have a question on the back of that. So this is something that you said a few years back in an interview. One of the biggest and most catastrophic problems that our people face, alongside the poverty, alongside the loss of land, is our loss of belief in ourselves. At the heart of that brokenness is a lack of belief in how extraordinary we are as a people. When you see that spark being rekindled, it is an incredibly joyous event, and you know you've been part of something transformative, not just for that person, but for all of their future generations. Now, before I get on to my question, that's a beautiful sentiment, full stop. And it's also the quintessence of the worldview that we're trying to propagate via positive development. So first and foremost, I tip my hat to you for that sentiment. I think that's beautiful. As for the question, I'm a massive advocate of anything that encourages the development of genuine self-belief. That is a big part of me in general. So my question is this: how do you blend the need to acknowledge and educate yourself and others about past injustices and even brutality against your people with the need to move forward and remain optimistic about creating a future of genuine coexistence? So how do you blend those two things of respect for the past, but need to move positively and productively into the future?
Well, I think the first thing that comes to mind, and thank you for finding that quote, is that healing from anything it doesn't have a beginning and an end. It's a journey, and any brokenness, the journey towards healing and mending is always going to be an ongoing project on yourself. And when you're doing that healing as a whole population, as a whole people, then it can be fraught. But it could also, and I genuinely mean this, be incredibly joyous. So Māori people lived in rural isolation and poverty very much until the Second World War. Most of our land was gone. We were reduced, from 66 million acres to 3 million acres by the turn of the 20th century. And we're living, my parents' generation lived in abject poverty. And in 1960, which is now 65 years ago, they moved to the city. I often refer to it as being a little bit like the Beverly Hillbillies. They popped me on the back of the truck. I was just a child, a wee bairn being taken to the city, da-da-ding-ding-ding. And because that was where the work was, they didn't want to leave our tribal homelands behind. And so at the age of 6, I came to live in the city. I found out first that I was brown. Who knew, when everybody around you was the same colour in your tribal homeland, and B, that I was poor. Also, who knew, because we were rich in each other. And so like a generation of Māori coming and being transplanted in the city, a lot of brokenness came out of that poverty. And we still have the legacy of that brokenness, that intergenerational poverty and trauma that can destroy whole populations. And we see this manifest in Native Americans and First Nation Aboriginals and Australia, wherever colonisation has occurred, it has literally broken the backs of the Indigenous First Nations. So the revitalisation process, which really began in this country, we mark the 1970s as that period when that began, and for not just for us, but for many other activist groups. If you look at, women's liberation and anti-Vietnam and the nuclear-free movements, all emerged at a similar point in time. But one of the consequences of that series of events in the Māori world, in Aotearoa, New Zealand, is, and this is the first step, you talk about how do we change, is understanding that having a voice is actually important. When you are broken, you lack what I call self-efficacy in the entrepreneurship literatures. You lack a belief that you can make a difference. And when you get involved in activism and you see the changes happening, it is extraordinarily empowering. So we have been on a journey of rediscovering our identity. And as part of that, it hasn't just been about relearning our language, which almost became extinct and is very much an agenda in the Indigenous worlds around the planet, but also language bears the values. All language. And I mean, I don't want to be inflammatory, but this conversation we're having at the moment about pronouns, which is highly inflammatory. In my language, I cannot say he and she. We do not have a word. I cannot look at somebody and go, she is or he is, because gender is not important in my language. One pronoun, third person pronoun. So that tells you a little bit about our culture. And the most important power that you can have is mana, which is a word shared across the Pacific. It means power, prestige. It's the equivalent of money, but it's a movable feast. You earn mana by your actions and you diminish mana by your actions, and it's intergenerational. So when I do good works, my great-great-grandchildren will be able to look back and say, she had mana. I would never say that. That's utterly inappropriate. So those kinds of values caught up in the language system. And so revitalization of the language has also meant a resurgence in those values, some of which have been incorporated into New Zealand culture in a very positive way. The idea of guardianship, of being a steward of the planet, is actually woven into our Research Management Act, because the word is kaitiakitanga, which means that we all have a responsibility to be guardians and stewards. And that is woven into some legislation for environmental protection in this country. So, we've had an impact as we've been on this journey. It's a kind of long-winded way of answering your question, but I think it's really about recognizing that the Maori journey to self-determination it has not finished. It's actually an ongoing work. And putting the self into self-determination is the agenda. And I think that's not just a Maori agenda. I think it's an agenda for all of humanity that has been individuated. And this is very much came out of Europe in the Age of Enlightenment, when Descartes said, ego sum lux te, I am the light, I think, therefore I am, which separated the brain from the power of God and the aristocracy. And so science is born, and which is great. We all love science. It answers important social problems, but it has also individuated humankind in a way that was not prevalent prior to the Age of Enlightenment in Europe. And that got exported around the world as not just a way of seeing the world, but the way of seeing the world.
It's too mechanistic.
It's very mechanistic. The distinction between the private and the personal, the political and the family. Somehow or other, the family is inferior to the political, external. These were ideas exported from Europe in the 16th century that became accepted around the world as a norm, and were the first step, in my view, of the dislocation of the physical and the metaphysical, the body and the spirit, which in my culture and the culture of many indigenous peoples are intimately woven together. You cannot walk through the world without understanding. You carry all your ancestors on your shoulders, and they lead you and they direct you and they empower you, but your job is to be the shoulders for the future generations. And so when you understand that is your role as a steward, and you understand that is your job, then connection to place and people becomes such an intrinsic part of that work. You cannot do that as an individual. You don't want to do that as an individual. We as a species, the human species is a social creature, and to separate us from that deep connection with place and people is, I think, to weaken us spiritually. So the longer term aspiration for those of us involved in revitalization of language is also revitalization of culture and philosophy and worldview. And that is what we bring to future generations who feel somehow that they can't make a difference. My PhD looked at successful business people, that every single one of them that I interviewed had somebody who told them that they were cool. That's the first step in self-efficacy, is somebody believing in you. If somebody else believes in you, you will believe in you. Positive contributions are about giving that positive energy to everybody around you, because you know what? You get it back. Reciprocity in social relations is such a fundamental component. You walk down the street and you smile. Okay, every third person's going to think you're a serial killer. In between, oh my God, it's the clown. But in between times, you're going to get people who get it. That it's so much easier to walk down the street being an insular bubble, locked in your own world of pain or trauma or fear or whatever is keeping you constrained. That is so much easier than just walking out the door and going, oh my God, what a beautiful day. Oh my gosh, here are two new people in my life.
And you never know, sorry to interject really quickly, but you never know what the ripple effect of just a simple smile can be, because I've had days which have made a 180-degree turn from being miserable to being great, just because someone was thoughtful and kind enough to smile at me.
Exactly. So joy and compassion and warmth, what I talked about before, aroha, which the Hawaiians use as a similar term, aloha, but now it's become a kind of cheesy greeting. But actually, when you understand the language, it has multiple layers of meaning, of generosity and kindness and love and empathy, and that is a choice. It's like being mindful is a choice, And so when you choose to make that your mantra, for lack of another word, then it actually reshapes and reconfigures your mind. And I think that's part of what positive development really is. For us, it was a matter of deconstructing the colonization of our minds. And you don't understand how colonized your mind is until you start to deconstruct it. Like, it's okay to not be 5'10" and blonde with large breasts. I'm 5 foot tall. I'm never going to be tall and blonde and the Western archetype of beauty. That's okay. But you have to deconstruct all of these images that are put on you about what is beauty, what is success, what is, having lots of money, having a bigger house. Yay, great. But actually, having a family that's close, having a community that's caring is a hell of a lot more sustainable than, having a beautiful body or a pretty eyes or, perfect features. I mean, those are they're so unreal in the grand scheme of things. I mean, we are humans. But we are made from stardust. We are literally descended from the cosmos. And we found out recently through physics that, the universe is thrumming to a beat. And the thing about Indigenous folks is that we listen to the beat of the cosmos. It's there in our music. It's there in our dance. It's there in our performance. And when you are one with the cosmos, when you are really part of it, then positivity flows.
Are you familiar with Joseph Campbell by chance?
A little, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I won't go on a digression there, but what you just said about listening to the pulse of the universe would be the kind of thing that he would say is absolutely essential to so many Indigenous cultures and part of its beauty.
Yeah. And Ella, first of all, kia ora, but I love what you went into with the individuation concept. And it kind of leads into my question for you, because I know that one of your foci is to restore that sense of self-belief in the Māori people. And I'm wondering if one of your ways of doing it may be to bring back into the foreground of their consciousness that the culture itself brings so many gifts to humanity. And the one that stood out in my mind is the gift of hongi. And there are many of our viewers are not familiar with what this is. Could you please describe it and what it means to the Māori people? I mean, It's an amazing thing to me.
The rubbing together of noses is part of the greeting, which we call hongi. But you've got it doesn't happen in isolation. It's part of a bigger context of greeting and welcome. So in our culture, we have very long hellos. We have a thing if we're meeting new people, if you're coming to our place. So because, as I said before, we're connected to the cosmos, and I believe I'm a descendant from my father, the sky, and my mother, the earth, because I'm made of stardust. When we gather first, we have a series of rituals. The first of which is that we will call you. And the reason that it's always the first voice you will hear in a welcome is a woman's voice. Our job is to call you and all of your ancestors. And then our men, and we do that, and our men stand behind, because the reason you're dead, you bring your dead with you wherever you go. They are on your shoulders, and we are welcoming and calling them. But we don't want our dead and your dead to harm each other, because sometimes our ancestors can be quite feisty. So the women call them, and the men stand behind, and then the men come to the front, and then they welcome the dead, and they welcome the living, and they welcome the unborn descendants. And they say, thank you for joining us. Now go, because we have to get on with the gathering of the day. And that relationship between you and your visitors is sanctified by the sharing of breath. So when you press your head, which is the most sacred part of your body, because it contains your brain and your connection to the metaphysical, and your nose, and your breath is shared, it means you have formed a relationship through that with that person. That means an undying commitment to care for each other and respect for each other. So the principle behind the hongi is, once you have had that relationship with somebody, you will never engage in warfare with each other. Sometimes that doesn't quite work out, but the road to hell is paved with good intentions.
Right.
And it's a principle, and it's a process whereby we say to each other, I affirm my relationship to you. I'm making myself as vulnerable as I can. I'm giving you my face, and you are giving me yours, and we are sharing breath, because the breath of life comes out of our nostrils. It's the first place that we breathe as a newborn, And so that is the purest form of breath. Sometimes when we talk, the breath that comes out of our mouth is not quite so good as the breath that comes out of our nose. So when we share the breath that comes out of our nose, that is the forging of peace. Does that make sense?
It does, and it's such a beautiful sentiment.
Absolutely.
I mean, it seems to acknowledge to me, as just a Westerner, that yes, you are an individual, and I'm glad to meet you, but we are one. That's what I love about it.
That's true. I mean, when you think about it, as a species, we've been on the planet for it took 4 billion years to build us. And we've been here for maybe 1 million years in this current form out of, 4,000 million years. And we have managed to screw it up royally in less than the last 10,000. And in fact, the last 100's probably been amongst the most dodgy of the species. And now we imperil not just our species, but the very land upon which we live. The oceans are heating up. When they get beyond a certain point of temperature, all of the sea life that has evolved over millions, billions of years to live at that temperature won't be able to go further. So, we're destroying our oceans, we're destroying our lakes, our rivers, the very water we breathe, drink, the air we breathe. And we're doing it. We're doing it kind of, you, me, the three of us are not necessarily doing it, but let's be clear, we are complicit. I have my phone right here, right? So there's my fancy schmancy phone. There's blood on that phone. There's, oh my God, what happened? Are you still there? Oh, sorry, a weird thing happened on my computer. That's what happens when you touch your phone when you're on a podcast. So whether we like it or not, we're complicit by our privilege. And I say that as somebody who, I may come from a culture that has suffered trauma, but I also have the enormous privilege of living in a developed nation. I know that many of my American friends think we're communists because we believe in free education and free health care and, a social service, but that's the way we were built in this country, but around the world. And so I accept and I own my privilege. I have a job that I love. Most of my parents' generation were long gone before they turned 70. So I'm so fortunate to still be alive and working and doing things I love and earning a good living and able to provide a path. That's privilege. And so the first step I genuinely believe in making real and meaningful change is own your place in the cycle and acknowledge that the farm that we have created as a species, the human race, who called it a race, the human species, that if we can't find solutions pretty quickly, actually, then all of the future is imperiled. All of our future generations are in very, very real danger. And, the post-apocalyptic stories of billionaires building fallout shelters. I mean, we have one of those. We have a billionaire in this country that came from yours who's building a fallout shelter, apparently. So, all the mountainous regions of the world will be populated by people who don't care. And I can't reach them, and you can't reach them, but maybe we can collectively, as a community of caring people who are standing up, not just in my country, but in all of the countries where we still have the right and the ability to stand up and saying, no, stop. All of us.
What I really like, Ella, is that you have walked the walk. I mean, as former executive director of Aotearoa, which our viewers will know as New Zealand, and the work executive director of Greenpeace. And I'm curious, what aspects of Maori culture informed your actions in the role as executive director of Greenpeace? And two-part question, what struggles still remain for Greenpeace in that part of the world?
Well, it was an interesting time. I had I was approached to apply for the job by somebody I worked with at the University of Auckland, which is where I was at the time, because of my background and my vocal aspirations for environmental protection. And I say this with all love in my heart, but not all people who are pro-green are necessarily aware of racism. And so there was actually backlash when I was appointed into that role because I was a Māori. And so that was an interesting. This was 1994 to 1996, so it's 30 years ago. But one of the things that I tried to do, and because Greenpeace attracts the most extraordinarily powerful, intelligent, motivated, committed people, I mean, it really is an incredible organization. And it has a terrible rap in a lot of countries, seen as some kind of quasi-terrorist group, because it dares to speak out about crimes against the environment. And they are crimes, pollution, conscious is a crime, and eco crime. And so that was, being part of that green world before I joined Greenpeace, and then being at the helm of an organization in this country that had a very noble history with Greenpeace, because the Rainbow Warrior was bombed here in 1985. And I was the executive director in 1995 when we had the 10-year memoriam, and Rainbow Warrior 2 came to New Zealand. And just as they were arriving in New Zealand, the French resumed testing in Mururoa. It was almost like they were, oh, look, there's a new Rainbow Warrior. Let's start blowing it. And I have friends who are Tahitian who are still living with the consequences. We have Australian soldiers who are still living with the consequences of the nuclear testing in Wimmera in the 1950s. So these are not problems that just go away because, we've got hand on heart saying we're great. So that level of activism and being involved really gave me the confidence, and it was 30 years ago, to believe that we, those of us who chose to band together under any kind of pro-environmental banner, were indeed the warriors of the rainbow, which is a kind of nice way to think about it. Being a warrior of the rainbow is, and therefore for a green peace is actually more than just a mantra. It's a way to walk in the world. And being a warrior of the rainbow does not mean being a warrior of violence and aggression. It means, what a rainbow manifests is good, clean water, good, clean skies, and to be a warrior of those things is the best struggle we can be involved in. So being able to unify people, being able to bring us together, and we said that, Rainbow Warrior 2 back to Mururoa. Interestingly, a lot of people may not know this, but our scientists in Greenpeace International had pioneered a revolutionary new technique to be able to transmit images down a telephone line. That was in 1995. That was new technology. And they had mounted cameras on Rainbow Warrior 2 and had a great big thick steel compartment where the comms was, so that the French, when they came onto Rainbow Warrior 2 and started beating everybody up and brutalizing them, didn't realize those images were beamed live to Reuters. It took 15 minutes back then for the images to get through. But half an hour after this attack occurred, it was being watched on French and European television, and was pivotal in the next French elections, and was pivotal in the changing of France's policy. So for me, that's a classic example where green thinking, good science, and activism had a profound impact on the politics of a whole nation. Community works.
Beautiful, because it was done from the heart, not with, antagonism.
You touched on a very interesting and sensitive word for me earlier, Ella. You were talking about privilege. And I believe what you said is something along the lines of one needs to acknowledge one's own privilege. And part of the reason why that's such a strong word with me is, and this may at first seem like burying one's head in the sand and pretending that the unfortunate things in the world that are happening are not happening. But I don't believe that's the case. I often use the word privilege to flip the script in relation to how we view global problems, because on the one hand, there's an enormous amount of doom and gloom in the world. And personally, I'm convinced that the world doesn't need me to go into doom and gloom as well. I feel like that part of the ecosystem, the doom and gloom within the human ecosystem, that's already fulfilled. It probably needs a little bit more optimism, but optimism backed by action. And so what I think of in terms of the privilege is, instead of looking at the global issues we're facing today and putting our head in the sand and saying, oh my God, we're screwed, this is terrible, we're going to hell in a handbasket, it's flipping it around and saying, my God, if we band together, if we find like-minded individuals, if we get as optimistic and as innovative as we can possibly get, we're actually in a position of privilege. We can potentially be that generation that future generations, plural, will look back at and say, thank you for having been here, because you were at a pivot point and you chose to go in a given direction rather than the other. And because of that, subsequent generations are able to flourish. So just in order to be able to get out of bed some mornings, I have to tell myself, no, I have the privilege of meeting and working with and supporting people who can turn things around in the world by doing positive things. Does that make sense? I realize that might seem a little bit airy-fairy, but that's the way I look at privilege.
You are looking at the queen of the fairies.
Brilliant. Brilliant. Please elaborate. Go for it.
Being airy-fairy is really nothing more than, so the word in the Māori language, moi moia, means to dream. So moi means sleep. So when you say a word twice, you mean deep, deep. So deep, deep sleep is dreaming. And so we dream in our deepest state of subconsciousness so that we can actualize in our wakeful time. And so your use of the word privilege, I think, really concurs with mine, in that the first real step for change is believing that you can. We talked about the importance of self-efficacy, and owning the fact that you have the tools, because all privilege is a basket of tools.
Oh,
you know,
I like that.
I mean, whether it's wealth or whether it's my race or my gender or whatever, privilege is nothing more than all of the basket of wealth that you have, whether it's your spiritual well-being, your mental or material or whatever. So you take your privilege, you own it, you don't apologize about it. You say, yes, I accept this graciously, and now I'm going to put it to work. And so your privilege, my privilege is waking up in the morning and knowing we have a job to do and we have some tools to do it with. And in mine, it is the voice that comes with being an academic. I don't have a huge amount of material wealth, but I'm very middle class by comparison to my previous generations, for 2 or 3 before, who lived in dire and abject poverty. I have choices that come with being middle class. And it's a weird use of the term class, because class is just a social construct, but it also means I have some financial security. That is part of my privilege. That is part of the basket of tools that I bring to the table, is the fact that if I want to give to some project financially, I can, and it won't hurt. We just had a prime minister in this country, because we still have at least 250,000 out of a 5.5 million population. That's a sizable chunk of children who live in poverty. So I pay my taxes to ensure that we provide as many resources as we can to them. And one of them under the previous government was free lunches. And the current regime got rid of the free lunches and replaced them with a much cheaper option. And there's been so many complaints about them. And the other day, a young boy was opening his lunch, and it was so hot and had been heated, had been delivered that way, that it exploded and it gave him second-degree burns. A child opening what is supposed to be a kindness conferred by a country is received injury. And the Prime Minister said, well, if they don't like it, the parents can just give them a Vegemite sandwich and an apple, or a Marmite sandwich, which I know you Americans don't really know about Vegemite or Marmite, but, it's the glue that's bound the Commonwealth together for a long time.
I tried eating it when I lived in Australia, and I thought it was appalling.
It's a quiet taste.
Vegemite from the song by Men at Work.
That's right. I come from the land down under. But we grew up in it. But the implicit assumption by a rich white man who happens to be the prime minister of my country, that if your children don't like the free lunches the taxpayers providing, just make them a sandwich, and that to me showed a lack of awareness of the reality of being poor in a country that it prides itself on not having poverty. And it was a galvanizing moment. There was a strong reaction, which I'm really proud of as New Zealanders. We said, no, that's not. There was backtracking, which is good because it shows that we have political leaders that are listening to the people and that understand when they've said something that didn't go down. But the meme of the week was his face on a Marie Antoinette. The famous quote she said when the poor protested, we'll let them eat cake. And it's now, we'll let them eat Vegemite sandwiches. So owning your privilege is not just about being a man or being a Westerner or being American or British or whatever. It's about whatever resources you bring to the table and acknowledge and own. That's what you can put to work.
It's a heartening thing to hear that the way that we look at privilege in terms of positive development is something that resonates with you and makes sense in that way, because I think it doubles back on that optimism and also that empowerment aspect. It is an act of personal empowerment to say, no, I have the privilege of being alive in 2025 and being able to help my fellow man and my planet. That is a privilege. That's not just bullshit. Those aren't just words as far as I'm concerned.
Absolutely. And simply just the saying of it, the expressing of it is a form of empowerment.
Absolutely.
Bad stuff happens, and bad stuff has happened to me over my life, and I've realized only much later that the choices you have, because you have choices, we're sentient beings, when bad shit happens, is that you can be a victim of it or a survivor of it. And that is a personal choice. And I know it's very hard for people who've been through a lot of trauma to acknowledge that, but I think that's the first step in personal healing, is to say, I choose to be a survivor. I choose to use this trauma as a tool in my survival and my empowerment rather than an instrument of torture. And when I think you make that very conscious decision, you all the rest flows from that. And I'm inspired by many of the people who have survived, the Holocaust survivors, the African American movement, all around the world. There have been people who stood up and said, I am not a victim, and I am going to take control of my destiny, and I'm going to do it one step at a time.
There's a quote, and I'm going to pull it up here because I want to read it exactly. What we do for each of the episodes is the little static window for each episode that you see on YouTube is a quote that pertains to the episode. And for our very first episode, we had this quote from Buckminster Fuller, and it's a quote I've always loved along these lines. And the quote is, "In order to change an existing paradigm, you do not struggle to try and change the problematic model. You create a new model and make the old one obsolete." And in a way, that's what we're seeking to do. It's a bit like what we were saying before we started recording today, that while we acknowledge that there are a lot of people on the left and the right fighting and slinging mud at each other, we feel like we would do better to not pretend that that's not happening, but step around it and move in a more productive direction to create a paradigm that almost renders all of that fighting obsolete. Because it's my personal view that I'm not sure that the biggest problem in the world today is the problems that people are fighting about. I think the biggest problem in the world today is the fact that people are fighting about the problems. And
Yeah,
I'm wondering to what extent you, from a mindset perspective, what you think about that, and does that resonate with you?
Absolutely. And it's such an interesting thing. I mean, I know that we've gone down a slightly different track talking about this earlier, but revisiting the topic has got me thinking about some other things. So at the moment, we're currently engaged in this country in a high level of protest and activation against some legislation that's been proposed by the current coalition government. And one of those pieces of legislation is to change the founding document of or the principles and the way they are enacted in legislation for the founding document. So there are not many countries, the United States is one, that can point to a date that your country began. You know, for yours it's the 4th of July, 1776, I believe.
Correct.
For ours, it is the 6th of February, 1840, the day we became a British colony, a part of the British colonies. And an agreement was made between Maori and the Crown. And basically all of that agreement's been broken and breached. So we're fixing that up. But so there's a lot of tension at the moment going on. But I'm watching tension in other parts of the world. So the French, who have, I think, are very interesting. You know, they got so grumpy with their aristocrats, they chopped their heads off, which is a fairly succinct way of saying we're not happy. Just say.
I like the term grumpy to describe the French
Grumpy.
Revolution. Good girl. Good
Yeah.
girl.
Very, very grumpy, the
Very-
French, you know, les
very
miserables.
grumpy.
So when we get grumpy, we don't chop people's heads off, we go for a walk. And we've been walking for 50 years. This is what a grumpy Maori looks like. They've got a banner and they're walking. And in many ways, that is our antidote to the negativity. So yes, there will be conflict on these activations, but the reality is the vast majority of us want to feed back positive energy. And the word that I use to describe that is which is similar in Hawaiian, except it's aroha in Hawaiian and it's aroha in Maori, which is a word, means it's often translated as love, but it's so much deeper than that. It's empathy, it's kindness, it's warmth, it's understanding, it's compassion. And so when we meet anger with aroha, it changes the dynamic. It's the same way as in confronting aggression with a smile, you know, and that is your choice. And there are many, many images. I mean, the woman in Tiananmen Square, you know, in 1989, holding flowers up against the tanks, etc., etc. Many cultures. This is not unique to Māori. This is, I think, unique to people who want to use peace to overcome war, rather than war to overcome war. And often the underpinning of war is rapacious greed. You know, that's all that war has meant for most of the times. It's invading countries and taking the wealth of countries and expropriating their cultures and their language and their science or whatever. You know, it's underpinning warfare is often this notion of rapacious greed. And the only way that you can really counteract that, unless you're going to get involved in the, you know, who's got the biggest weapon of mass destruction, which seems to be kind of where we're at right now, is to, as community, as a species, as people, use love to counteract hate.
So,
Love that.
yeah,
The
that,
alchemy of converting that.
so that aroha, am I pronouncing it more or less correctly?
Absolutely.
Okay.
It's beautiful. Thank you.
Oh, no, thank you. It's a beautiful concept. That aroha concept, does that, I love that. My next question was going to be, and I think it does overlap with that aroha concept. And this does fall under the umbrella of practical impact of the work that you've done. My question that I had written out was this, that of all the projects you have worked on in the past or are working on now, is there one in particular that really encapsulates the ethos of your approach? And I would like to amend that question or make an addition to that question of asking, is there one particular project that you've worked on that not only encapsulates your approach, but brings that aroha concept to bear and has really borne fruit because of its peaceful and productive nature?
Oh, that's such a tough question because, again, this goes back to my privilege. I've had the privilege of spending the last 35 years getting paid to do what I love, which is studying my people, my history, and what works. You know what I mean? If you grew up in a family where people worked in a factory where going to work was drudgery every day and torture, that to realize that I've been able to devote my whole adult life to studying myself. Yeah, which is kind of weird and egotistical when I say it like that, but really myself within the context of my people. And so it's not really that there's one particular project, but there's been a number. So my PhD, which looked at what I called emancipatory Māori entrepreneurship, which was really business for emancipation and self-determination, because business doesn't have to be about exploiting people and planet. It can be truly about organizing community for fundamental positive change and social justice. So emancipatory entrepreneurship, that has fed through into my research and into my teaching and into the program I'm currently teaching around Māori entrepreneurship. But along the way was learning that actually the ingredients to emancipatory entrepreneurship are not rocket science. You know, they're having people around you that believe in you, that make you feel good about yourself, that make you believe in yourself, that teach you that you are a spiritual being connected and that you have responsibilities. That's the basis of that theory. So some emancipatory entrepreneurship stuff, collective leadership, and going back and revisiting my culture with a group of my, a research team, and coming up with notions of relational leadership. Because I don't come from a culture that has a hierarchy of leadership, but we were colonized by a country or a philosophy that is very hierarchical. You know, Britain in the 18th and 19th century, I mean, there was God, then the king, and then the Lord, and then the church, and and then the middle classes, and then right down at the bottom, the people who did all the work that fed everybody above them were the peasants. You know, and that's what got exported around the world through the document of discovery, which gave intrinsic rightness through that papal bill for any European culture to civilize any savages they came across as an act of godliness. So that hierarchy of power was exported around the world, not just by Britain, France, Holland. The Belgians were particularly interesting. And so this idea of equalized power was very much important. I come from a culture that is very much founded on relational collective leadership, and particularly gender-free. So men and women held equal power, which, we were colonized as much by patriarchy as we were by Christianity and imperialism, and our boys have done okay out of it by and large. Just saying. And so the work I've done on leadership, Māori leadership, and being able to revisit what collective leadership looks and feels like is also a piece of work that I've thoroughly enjoyed being a part of. And finally, the third, I suppose, prong of my main research thrust over the last 35 years has been to restore knowledge of the power of women in pre-contact society. So what we call mana wahine, the mana of wahine women, which was lost on the day that we signed the Treaty of Waitangi, and we gained all the rights of British citizens. One of those rights was that in Britain in 1840, women were chattels. They were literally owned by their fathers, which is why they had their father's surname, until they were given away in marriage, and thereafter were branded with their husband's name, and all of their children had their husband's name. So there are no women in the genealogy of Europe, because except Spain. Actually, Spain's interesting. So there's some
they have multiple last names. Yeah,
they have, yeah. But by and large, women had no ownership rights, no property rights in Britain in the 19th century, and so that impacted on our women, and we lost. And so there's currently a claim before the Waitangi Tribunal called the Mana Wahine claim to reinstigate. I mean, it'll never get settled because, blokes don't like giving up power. Let's be very clear. That's one privilege they've come to really enjoy over the last couple of thousand years. So they ain't given that up easily. But just to have the conversation about the duality of power that's reflected in a dual cosmology. We don't say in traditional Māori society, our Father who are in heaven. We say our Father who are in sky and our Mother who is out the earth. And when you have that kind of philosophy, it does impact on a whole range of social institutions. So I guess my work on the role of women in traditional society, collective leadership, and emancipatory entrepreneurship are the three areas that I've been able to devote the most energy to and the most passion to and then lots of other little things have come out of that. But I'm very proud to have been part of the growth and the development of a very specific type of Māori science. And when I first started my master's thesis 35 years ago, and I said I wanted to look at Māori science in the business school at Auckland University, I was like, there is no such thing. And even 2 years ago, we had, an esteemed British Lord and Oxford Don saying, Māori don't have a science. There's only one science, for God's sake. And it's mine. Everything else is not. And so we've been arguing for Indigenous knowledge as science for decades. And now we're starting to get some traction in Australia. They're realizing that the Aboriginal pathways and the Aboriginal burn-offs were actually ancient science for managing a relationship with the environment, not over the environment. The Sherpas of the Himalayas have lived for thousands of years in an intimate relationship with their mountains and with their ancestors, like we see our mountains, except their mountains are bigger, until it became a tourist attraction. And now they're slaves to the tourist trade of individualistic Westerners who think, that they've somehow conquered something by climbing a mountain instead of changing the world. And you can spend $500,000 to climb Egmont. For what?
Yeah. Well,
and Kiwi did it first.
The real mountain to be climbed is the one within, in terms of changing the way that you look at things in the world. That's the real mountain to climb.
I believe so. Yeah. And that's part of, the whole point why I'm enjoying this conversation and the work that you are both doing with your podcast is how we get those conversations out. Because, I talk about this stuff all the time, and every now and again somebody says, oh my God, I haven't thought about it like that. You literally watch somebody having an epiphany in front of your very eyes because solutions are not complex. To me, they start first with me, and then the people around me, and then the community, and moving in a direction for good and for positive energy. And we can all be engaged in that one.
Part of the reason why, and I appreciate the compliment regarding this podcast and what we're trying to do, part of the reason why it exists and part of the reason why I am beginning to branch out into consulting work and doing large-scale stuff. I love large-scale stuff because why not? The bigger the positive impact you can have, the better as far as I'm concerned. But part of the reason why this exists is it comes back a little bit to what you're saying about personal empowerment. And part of personal empowerment, as far as I'm concerned, is recognizing what your individual skills are. And for whatever reason, one of the things that I've always been good at and found particularly easy is my ability to look at things differently than most other people. The whole point is to try to take that and to channel that looking at things differently capacity in a positive direction to hopefully benefit the world as much as I can.
That's all scholarship is. That's all critical thinking is the ability to look at something from multiple angles, to triangulate information. I always tell my students when I make them read big books, and you can tell they look at it and they go, oh, this is so big and so boring. I say, the better you are at consuming knowledge, the better you will be at producing it. So critical analysis is how you look and read and absorb information from multiple dimensions. You triangulate, you check, you assess. That's all critical analysis is. So when you look at the pretty brochure with, pretty colourful brochure, your first thought is, well, where did they get that information from? Cite your sources. No, that's opinion, not evidence. So the better you are at critically analysing information, the better you're going to be at producing good quality information. And we need good quality information to encourage people to, as you said, think outside of the box, to think from multiple dimensions. And so I see the role of the scholar, not just in New Zealand, but around the world, as being very much the person who helps others to do that, who shares the tools that make that a norm in the way you walk in the world, is to be a critical thinker, to be a critical analyst. And it's no accident, I think, that when dictatorships emerge, amongst the first victims of tyranny are the fourth estate, those who hold the powerful to account, and scholars. And you look at every dictatorship in recent history over the last few hundred years, and those, you go first for the storytellers or the media, and then you go for the thinkers, the scholars. And once you've got them out of the way, then you can control the mind of the masses. And once you have them being entertained with, bread and circuses, you can do with what you like.
Yeah. Feeding them basically the psychological equivalent of tat on television.
Yeah. And a couple of years back, because I did my undergraduate degree was in sociology, which, by the way, ruins you forever, sociology. But when I in my undergraduate years, they made us read a bit of the ancient Greek thinkers, and I was particularly taken with Plato's work on the Republic, which, considering it was written a couple of thousand years ago, dude had some interesting ideas, and his notion of the evolution of human societies from what he called aristocracy, but which I would call sort of old-style community leadership. The people, the rulers were your uncles and aunts. And then that evolution from that to the sort of bureaucratization or the formalization of it, to the holding of power in certain hands, to the reaction against that to what he called democracy, and then the crisis of democracy, too much freedom leading to tyranny. And that was used very much to explain Nazism and Hitler and Mussolini in Europe. But I think that there are places on the planet now where we could apply that same lens. And it's disconcerting.
Well, it is disconcerting. And how do you personally, in your own mind, not only in your own mind, but also in your interactions with others and in your work, what do you do to transmute that negativity into something positive and productive?
I mean, I have conversations like this. I have conversations like this all the time, not just in a public forum or in a classroom, but in my interactions with, my children are aged between 30 and 40. So they're part of those interesting generations coming through. I have 3 daughters. And so I interact in their world, with their peers, and we have conversations. It's about talking. We developed this extraordinary capacity as a species to convert guttural grunts into deep philosophical thought. Do you know what I'm saying? That's kind of a gift, because maybe 10,000 years ago it was like, and we converted all of these things, and we've managed to convert it into a couple of hundred main languages, written texts. This is an amazing capability that we have as humans. I'm sure the goldfish do have that capability, but they forget the next day. So, I don't know how relevant that is. So voice, I guess what I'm saying is we have, as a species, created voice, and we have an obligation to use that voice for good, whether it is as storytellers, and I come as a Māori from ancient tradition of storytellers. We didn't have a written language, so all of our science was woven into story. And the story of the stars, so that we navigated our way across the Pacific, by saying, so at a certain time of the year, that guy there comes out of his house and goes to court that woman there, and for a little while they get together, and that's the Matariki or Pleiades constellation, which we can only see at a certain time of the year. And if you follow that, you will go in a particular direction. That will get you where you go. So we've been using story for centuries, not along with most other cultures on the planet. So first is acknowledging you have a voice, and then using that voice to tell stories for change.
I have a question to ask, and feel free to answer in the negative if required, but there's so much that we're yet to get to. Would you be, in the relatively near future, amenable to coming back for a part 2?
Sure. Look, this has been fun. In New Zealand, it's Saturday morning, and you gave me an excuse to get up early. Ordinarily on Saturday morning, I have a wee lie-in, and make a nice big cup of coffee and meet new people and talk about the stuff I like to talk about. So, where's the downside of that?
Yeah. So within these last 5 minutes here before we wrap up, is there anything that, I suppose this is a bit short notice for this, but along the lines of what's the most interesting question you've never been asked? Before we wrap up this particular episode, is there anything in any direction you'd like to go, anything that you would like people to know about you, your work, the way you view the world, maybe something along the lines of optimism? Is there anything that you would like to share over these next 5 minutes or so?
You know what, and I'm going to kind of speak, I think, to anybody who's watching this. If you've made it to this point in this discussion, which is great, because sometimes people believe that most of us have an attention span of about 30 minutes, after which we're trying to remember whether we turned the laundry light off. If you've made it this far in, I guess my question or my comment to you would be, keep on going. It is in the darkest of times that we find our inner light. And I know that sounds cheesy but it's kind of true. And I know there are places on the planet at the moment, right now, as we speak, in Africa and Asia and Europe, that are facing extraordinary darkness. And if we who have the privilege to be able to participate in this kind of discourse are listening at this point, I would ask you to find the light and to use that light, to shine that light for goodness in the world of people who don't have access to that kind of privilege right now.
I'm so grateful you're here, because you really, and I can see Dante nodding, and I know Dante well enough. You couldn't fit in better with the way that Dante and I look at things. Well and truly. Dante, do you have anything before we wrap up?
No, I mean, just everything was so perfect. Thank you so much, Ella.
No worries. It's been really fun.
Yeah, again, I thank you, and in our downtime we'll try to see what we can organize for a part 2 in the relatively near future, because I feel I can feel it in my voice right now. I'm speaking much softer and much calmer. There isn't a tightness in my chest or throat that maybe there is otherwise when trying to manage and do something like this. So just your presence has been very, very calming but uplifting at the same time. And to go back to the word privilege, and Dante knows this because I don't shut up about it when we talk, this whole voyage of positive development, including this podcast, is one of the most gratifying adventures I've been on in such a long time. So I want you to understand that when we say thank you for being here and lifting us up like this, and hopefully our viewers as well, we really do mean it, and very much look forward to having you back again.
Thank you. That's really kind. And, bring that softness, bring that light into everything we do, and every day becomes a gift.
Well, thank you again to both of you. And before we move on to our post-recording business, I will just thank all of our viewers for being here. We hope that you got as much out of this as we did. And to our viewers, I will say onward and upward.